So in the middle of the 1800s, during the Civil War and Reconstruction, the United States is going through its second industrial revolution. Now we're going to see more people moving from farms to factories. There is not much government regulation, and this was called laissez-faire, or a French term meaning hands-off. Businesses like this, workers did not. Also at this time, there were many monopolies created, where one business would control all of the industry, and there was less competition, and this meant that there was lower pay or wages for workers, and the cost of goods went up. So there was higher prices, as well as more profits for those businesses. In the Midwest, there was an improvement in technology leading to another agricultural revolution. Sometimes we call this mechanization, meaning more machines. So we have things like steel plows, mechanical reapers, and barbed wire. What all of this new technology does is increase profits for farmers, and more Americans to make money will move west. A grange is created, and this is basically a cooperative or a group of farmers who help push for state laws to regulate prices set by the railroad companies, because many felt the prices were too high. To encourage Americans to move out west, the federal government passed a law called the Homestead Act, right in the beginning of the Civil War. And what it did was it gave millions of acres to Americans as long as they would farm the land for a certain time period. This was called, again, the Homestead Act. And as a result of this act, the Americans who qualified for it and moved out west would get about 160 acres of land. As a result of this, Americans moving west increased violent tensions with Native American tribes. One of the more infamous occurrences was called the massacre at Wounded Knee, and this occurred between the Sioux tribe and the American government, the Army. The Sioux tribe was attacked by the U.S. Army, who tried to remove the natives to small pieces of land called reservations. Many of the Sioux were killed as a result of this, and the purpose was not because they didn't like Americans per se, but being forced off the land onto reservations to farm as opposed to using hunting and gathering was very much opposed by the natives. Another thing was that these reservations, they were small. They also were not very good for farming, so they were not fertile soil. It was bad soil. So even if the natives moved, they were going to still be living in poverty as a result. The natives who did comply with American wishes, had a lot of cultural changes that many resented. One of the senators in government, Senator Daw, who passed the Dawes Act, and what this did was it forced Native Americans to assimilate, which means to become similar. And it was a law that made them adopt the American way of life. So assimilation is to be similar, but the natives were forced. Here we see a picture of girls who are dressed more like Americans than natives. They're in an American education system, and they are reading from the Bible typically at first. So they're trying to change their religion as well. So by cutting hair, changing their names to Christian names, and dressing like Americans, the idea was that natives would be brought into American society. At the time, this was seen as the more kind thing to do because many wanted to exterminate or kill off the natives. Again, as a result of Americans moving west, there was a decline of buffalo. And since natives lived off the buffalo for sustenance or for living, many natives were forced onto reservations. And these buffalo were hunted by Americans for sport, not to live on. And so this decline in the buffalo from over 1 million to less than 1,000 in less than 50 years really hurt the Native Americans' ability to live on their own. And then many became dependent on the US government for help. As the farmers moved out west, they began to form political parties. The most notable was the Populist Party. And this Farmers' Party had a couple of goals. They wanted the government to own the railroads. They thought the rates were too high. They wanted a graduated income tax, which meant if you made more money, you paid more taxes than people who made less than you. And they wanted direct election of senators. They didn't want the state to pick it. They wanted American voters to pick who would be representing them in government. The populists did not win many victories, but because they started to get a lot of following, the major political parties started bringing their ideas into the government. So sometimes third parties don't win, but their ideas do. As the US is moving west and fulfilling manifest destiny, one of the major infrastructure or technological improvements was the Transcontinental Railroad. This is connecting many parts of the country and improving the US economy. This was built by Irish and Chinese immigrant labor under harsh, difficult conditions with poor pay and treatment. The federal government passed what they called the Pacific Railway Act of 1862, and the federal government gave land to railroad companies basically for free. So this was free land or free money to these companies to build the railroads. It's kind of why many of the farmers wanted the government to control the railroad rates. As the need for labor went up, so did the increase in immigration. Except at this time, most of the immigrants were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. They were not met by a lot of open arms, and nativism increased, fear of immigrants or a distaste or dislike for immigrants. This also led to the creation of the Know Nothing Party, which was an anti-immigrant party who was angry about immigrant workers lowering the wages of American workers. Here we see an image, political cartoon of Uncle Sam representing the United States, kicking out Chinese immigrants, and they're portraying the immigrants in less than human ways. This law was called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which said that no one from China was legally allowed to emigrate to the United States under any circumstance. It was the first law preventing a specific ethnic group from entering America. Big business had two nicknames it was given. It was called robber barons by people who didn't like them because they felt like they were robbing resources from the smaller working class folks. And because they donated money, they were called philanthropists. Those are people who donate money for good causes. The Anti-Sherman Trust Act of 1890 outlawed monopolies. So while it was a good law, it was not always used. Again, monopolies were when one person or one business controlled the whole industry, and there was little competition, which was not good for workers or consumers who bought their goods. Imagine if Nike was the only shoe company that you could buy from. I don't think many of us would be happy. So in this cartoon, we see Rockefeller holding the government in his palm, which shows that big business had a strong influence on government policies and rules. One of the social ideas at this time was called social Darwinism, which said that the government should not get involved in the economy. Those who are strong and smart and able to work hard will do well, and those who don't deserve it. So this idea is called social Darwinism. It's very similar to laissez-faire. Because of this, many workers did not receive good wages, good working conditions, and they went on strike. One of the most infamous labor strikes was the Homestead strike, where many were killed during the strike. There was also the Pullman strike, where President Grover Cleveland sent the U.S. Army to stop the workers from striking. So at this time, even though the government wasn't saying it was getting involved in regulating business, at many times it did get involved to help businesses by stopping strikes. So as the century went on, labor unions increased its membership. Again, a labor union was a group of workers who wanted less hours, more pay, and more safe working conditions. This would mean that the owners of the business and the investors in the business would have to take a little bit less of a profit to make sure that workers had a good pay and had safe conditions. They did not want to do this, though, those businesses. However, as strikers went up and labor union membership went up, the wages, hours, and conditions for workers got better. The term when workers and business owners would get together was called collective bargaining. Collective meaning together, and bargaining was like a negotiation or compromise. Again, they were bargaining or negotiating for hours, wages, and working conditions. The two most known labor unions at this time were the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor. Both were working for pay, wages, and hours, and used collective bargaining and strikes as negotiating tactics for their workers. These tactics were called bread and butter issues, and they were much more popular with the American Federation of Labor.